what makes us human is that we're victors over nature, that we master and command and transform it to make our lives better. And that with technology like this, we gain something. We live up to our nature and our capability of harnessing our potential to have happier, healthier, more flourishing lives. How much would you pay to ensure you could have a perfectly healthy baby? How much would you pay to prevent your future child from having a birth defect or a tragic disability? For the first time, this is becoming a real possibility for parents to choose. Orchid is a new Silicon Valley tech startup which grants parents the ability to screen their embryos for over 1,000 diseases before pregnancy. However, there are those who don't think Orchid should exist and who don't want parents to be able to make such a choice. Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute Podcast. I'm Samantha Watkins, Junior Fellow. With me is Mike Mazza, Associate Fellow. Hi, Mike. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Sam. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so a few weeks ago, Ross Dowdett of the New York Times, he interviewed the founder of Orchid, Noor Siddiqui, on his podcast, Interesting Times. And, he was interviewing her about her company, the tech that she's created, and, posing a number of critiques or objections and moral questions about the technology. And the clips went quite viral on social media. It started a firestorm. Lots of people were kind of panicking that this is a harbinger for some sci-fi dystopia in the future. And so I wanted to kind of go through the podcast with you today, bring up some of the objections that he names, talk through them, and some of the moral questions that he names. But first, I wanted to start by kind of stepping back and what is this tech that Orchid has brought to the market, and what does it change for parents or for prospective parents? It's something I've been thinking about a lot just for personal reasons. I'm getting married soon. I'm hopefully starting a family soon, and so I've been looking into what currently exists pre-Orchid, and the options that are out there are like if you get pregnant the old-fashioned way, the traditional way, they're pretty limited, and the process is pretty harrowing. You you can test once you're pregnant. Tests have certain risks, and there are certain probabilities that they could be wrong. They're very limited. Like you only get to see a number of chromosomal anomalies, and that's it. It's still like it's very opaque, the whole process. And then if you do end up having issues and have to terminate the pregnancy, like that whole ordeal, like I'm like it's pre-harrowing for me thinking about it and going into possibly being, having a child in the future. And so what Orchid promises, what it has created, is tech that allows you to screen embryos prior to pregnancy to test the entire genome sequence, the entire DNA of an embryo for, I think she said, over 1,200 different diseases. She makes this really apt analogy that I really like in the podcast, where she says the traditional screening that we have today is like if you had a proofreader that only could look at the chapter titles of your book before you went to publish. And what Orchid promises to bring is a proofreader that looks at every line of the book and checks for errors. So I'm very excited about this technology. Obviously, Noor Siddiqui is excited about it as well. She talks about envisioning a future where this is the standard, that parents or prospective parents use this technology prior to starting a family. I'm curious, before we get into the podcast and some of the objections, what your initial reaction is.
Yeah, I mean the promise of this technology, even if the current version of the technology doesn't fully accomplish this, but the promise in the I assume in a near-term future is that we could have a world in which heritable illnesses, disabilities, diseases um, are gone. And not through some kind of cure, but just they don't arise in the first place. And I mean, that's really exciting just in terms of, from the perspective of a parent, um, if from the perspective of the medical profession, that then that'll be a whole class of research programs that won't be necessary anymore. You won't have to research for all these cures. You can focus your resources on curing acquired diseases, or diseases that don't have genetic um, um, predispositions. So that it's really exciting for the future of medical technology. And one other thing that's exciting about it to me is that there are people eagerly, actively, enthusiastically working on this kind of technology, and that they have eager customers. You mentioned you're thinking about this. I thought about it as well. That this is the kind of thing if I get to the point of having children, that I certainly want to explore. I mean, price depending. I think we'll talk about that later. Something else that I guess is not exciting but interesting is the reaction to it in the negative. I think I was I had the kind of reaction of surprise, but then like, yeah, but I shouldn't be surprised. That people find this technology morally objectionable, or at least questionable. And one of the things that's concerning to me is that these objections kind of cut across our cultural tribes. So Duthat is coming from the religious conservative perspective, but he's raising objections that in years past we'd expect to hear just coming from a kind of egalitarian left perspective. And some of the objections that the more left tribe type people are now raising, I think the disability objections we'll get to, have the flavor of some kind of magical thinking about personhood and our obligations towards other people. So the technology is exciting. Some of the reaction to it is exciting, and some of the reaction to it's concerning. So
Yeah, so let's get into some of the reaction to it and some of the objections to it. So we're gonna play a number of clips throughout this podcast from the original interview between Dowdett and Noor Siddiqui. The first one, we're just gonna play a snippet of what was like a 10-minute exchange going back and forth about the moral status of the embryo.
Orchid technology relative to having babies by having sex involves creating substantial numbers of embryos. Many of those embryos will not be used. They'll be kept on ice. They'll eventually be discarded. Do you think the embryos that are created in the orchid process have any kind of moral status whatsoever?
I think that embryos are extremely precious. I mean, they're the most miraculous and like magical cells that we've, I think, ever discovered, right? I mean, they somehow differentiate, into the trillions of cells that make, you and I.
Does it matter? Is it, like if I took the trays of embryos that contain you and your husband's embryonic children, and I threw them in the river, what kind of crime have I committed? Have I committed a property crime? Like, should I pay a fine? Like, what have I done?
So, as I mentioned, that was a short snippet of what was a 10-minute exchange going back and forth. And I found it quite painful to watch because Noor Siddiqui, she could never really give a straight answer. She could never really bring herself to say, no, the embryo doesn't have moral status, or yes, it does. She kind of equivocates and does wishy-washy, like, it's precious. And he keeps pressing her. And I think, the impact of that whole segment is Dowdett really has the moral upper hand. You can see that she's defensive, and she doesn't want to say no. And the question that he asks at the end of that, like, what kind of crime have I committed? If I take your embryos and I throw them away, I throw them in the river, what have I done? And he mentions, like, is it a property crime? He doesn't mention an alternative, but knowing that he's coming from a religious perspective and seeing the kind of firestorm that showed up online in response to clips like this, the alternative I think that he's wanting to suggest is that that this is murder because it's human embryos, and he has a religious perspective that, the embryo is as much of a human being as an individual person going about their lives. And so, in my perspective, I think Noor Siddiqui should say no. I think the embryo does not have the same moral status as an individual person, and I think the only way that you could come to the opposite perspective is if you have, a religious frame of mind, a mystical kind of view of an embryo, where once sperm meets egg, suddenly God has imparted a soul on this genetic potential, and now it's a human being with moral status and with rights that need to be protected. But if you actually are like rationally looking at the alternatives here, you have microscopic cells in a petri dish on one hand, and you have an individual person going about their life with people they love, with dreams they want to pursue, with things that they're doing, and to call throwing this petri dish in the trash and wantonly killing this person the same thing. Like these are not in the same category. They're not in the same universe of category. And the only way I think you can, attempt to rationalize and put them in the same category is if you have this religious view of embryos and souls.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. The exchange is painful to watch. I mean, Siddiqui's doing something with her company heroic, and she can't defend it. And I'm not really sure why. Maybe she herself has some kind of religious leanings that are she's like in conflict. I don't know her background, but she can't really articulate a good defense of it. And there's various places in the part of what makes it uncomfortable to watch is that at various places in the podcast they each accuse the other of framing the issue dishonestly. And my reaction at various times is kind of like they're both right. Like she's dodging a question, and she's probably just dodging it because she doesn't have a good answer. But still, that's if she's given what she's doing, she should be able to articulate a better answer. But yeah, I would say something about what Duthet's question is implying. And like you said, he doesn't straight up come and say it would be murder. But the kind of way he says, would it be a property crime is kind of like, yeah, it has to be more than that, right? Like, and my reaction is, well, it's whatever crime it would be to steal a woman's eggs or a man's frozen sperm. Like, one might have a pretty high value on those things, and for that reason it might not be a mere property crime, but it wouldn't be the kind of crime he's kind of gesturing at. It would be something like a murder or a homicide, or maybe he'd want to, if you really kind of pinned him down, he'd want to create a new category or something. But no, I don't think there's any value to them over and above any other reproductive material. Now, I think you should really think about the implications of his implication, which is that if there really is some moral value to these things, in the sense that a person has a moral value independent of other people's kind of relationship to then IVF should probably be illegal, or maybe just legal only if the woman's willing to do what they discuss elsewhere in the podcast, so-called compassionate transfer or compassionate implantation, where all of the produced embryos are implanted in the woman in a way that could but likely won't result in pregnancy. That's probably the only alternative if you have the perspective that there's something like personhood to the embryos. And I think it's really worth like spelling out how destructive that perspective is towards this. Like, it really is a revolutionary reproductive technology. Like, suppose you go to the your an IVF clinic and you contract with Orchid, and you do this because, why do people use it? Well, they have trouble getting pregnant. So that's the traditional reason to do IVF. But now there can be additional reasons. Suppose you have a high likelihood of having a child with a severe disability. So there are disabilities in which an unaffected parent can have as high as a 50% chance of having an affected child. The the one I particularly have in mind is Fragile X syndrome. So a woman with the gene has a 50% chance of having a male offspring with Fragile X and a 50% chance of having a male or female that's unaffected but carries the gene. So it's a really high chance. And just by the numbers of what they would have to do in order to, like a woman with that in that position would have to do to actually have healthy, let's say 2 healthy offspring, they have to create like at least like 16 or more embryos that would then have to go through the screening, and that's just to get like a 70-80% chance of actually having this success. And so if you create more, you'd have a higher percentage, and that's just for the screening of that one disorder. There's also the question of, okay, so they all passed the screening, and now, well, but there's 1,200 other things we can screen for. So you're talking about creating a high number of embryos, and then saying, well, you have to implant all of them. And, the compassionate transfer, they do it in such a way, my understanding is it's kind of like the rhythm method where they implant it in at a certain time in the woman's cycle. So it's just it's unlikely to take. But still, there's still some likelihood that it takes. If it's, 16 or more times of this, that's what you're doing to people. And the alternative is, well, you can't have kids, or you have to have kids with very severe disabilities. Like that's the position you're putting people in. So it's really a kind of wicked view. And now that the technology exists, if you do anything to block it, you are subjecting those people who could use this technology to that life. That is, you're forcing them now to have children with all these disabilities that they don't have to have. And you mentioned, where we talked about, like, where's Duthat coming from and thinking these embryos have some special value. I think it's worth like emphasizing that this has to be coming from his kind of magical or religious thinking. If you think about all the reasons human beings are valuable to you, like none of them apply to an embryo. It's not developing, learning, forming its own person. You're not like think of a parent watching the child grow and reach new milestones, and how proud that you are about that. And then think of the value of like not your own child, but another person. It's, they're productive and happy, and, depending on your relationship, like just knowing them can be a source of joy. But if they're just a stranger, just the fact that they're out there being, living a productive, good life is a better. None of that's true about an unimplanted embryo. So what's the source of the value? And it's probably coming from in another context, in the context of the abortion debate, I would guess he's a life begins at conception type person. And then he's transferring that philosophical religious position over into this new context. And obviously he's, in a sort of straightforward way, yeah, that's the implication of that. If life begins at conception, well, what do you mean by conception? It's like sperm enters egg. And that's they're doing in IVF. So then that's a person. Like that's the logic of it. But I mean, again, that's at least in the case of natural pregnancy, you can say, well, it's like developing now. Sperm enters egg, and then it attaches, and the whole process is going. None of that's, not even that's happening. So, I mean, this should be, if he were not thinking in a kind of mystical or magical way, the reaction should be, oh, maybe there's something wrong with this premise that life begins with a conception. Maybe that's not the right way to think about it, because now here I have, there's a sperm, but the whole process isn't going. That's pretty different than when it's actually inside someone's body. But that's not what's going on for him. It's no, this radically life-enhancing new technology is now suspicious. Like, that's the logic, and that's not coming from any kind of worldly moral concerns.
Right. Because if it were coming from that kind of like an individualist, like worldly concerns, like an embryo can have value to the prospective parents who want to actualize it, who want to bring a child into the world. But so can your eggs. Like a couple who's been trying for years to get pregnant, who's going through IVF, who retrieves eggs, like every healthy egg that they retrieve is like precious to them. It's a value to them because of the potential that it represents, but it's because it's a potential that they care about and they want to actualize, not because it's it's a real flesh and blood human being right here in front of you right now. So I want to turn to another objection that he names, and this one is coming more from, the view of like genetic trade-offs. Like, are there potential risks that we don't know about? So let's listen to that one.
My understanding is that the state of our actual knowledge of how the genome works and influences things like diseases is limited in all kinds of ways, and that there are sort of two sets of open questions about this kind of polygenic screening. First, just to what extent is it basically reliable? And second, to what extent do we just not know what other things a set of genes might be doing, right? So you can imagine a world where you look at an embryo and you say, it has this set of genes that make it somewhat more likely to have heart disease or Parkinson's. We don't want to use that embryo. But then it turns out that something in that set of genes also codes for resistance to disease or something like that, right? I think this concept is called pleiotropy, the idea that a set of genes can have different effects, right, in the same person.
I think what people are really asking when they talk about pleiotropy is this idea of genetic trade-offs, right? So, if you
Yes.
lower risk for schizophrenia, are you actually unknowingly increasing risk for another condition?
Yes.
And one thing that I love about genetics is that it's become a incredibly quantitative science. So what that means is that this idea of genetic trade-offs isn't the dominant story the data tells. The dominant story the data tells is actually that when you want to reduce risk for mental health disorders, you actually reduce risk for multiple diseases simultaneously, right? So heart disease is has the most correlation with things like atrial fibrillation and other cardiac conditions. So it's not the case that there's these massive genetic trade-offs that we know of, and then.
So one of the things that really jumps out at me with this kind of objection that Dowd is bringing up is the precautionary principle. This idea that if we don't have scientific certainty about potential risks or harms that a new technology might bring in the future, then the safest course of action, the most reasonable course of action, is to simply not use the technology until we know, to not develop it, to not put it into practice, whatever the technology might be. And you see this with all kinds of different tech, not just embryo screening. Like, you see it coming up with, for example, like GMOs. This idea that, well, maybe they might cause some unforeseen cancer in the future, and so the safest course of action is to hold off and to wait. They're never very clear exactly on how you're supposed to discover the knowledge, get the certainty that they desire if you're not using or developing the technology. But that is the basic idea. And so, I mean, it's a very myopic way of thinking about risk and, pursuing values. This idea that, you're going to focus on all the risks, like the risks of taking action, and completely ignore the risks of inaction, and ignore the real values that the technology brings at the same time. And it's especially egregious in a technology case like this, where it's not just that there are known values, but there are known risks that we're trying to avoid that are serious and harmful. We're saying that, oh, well, we know that you have the potential of, these horrible, tragic birth defects or developmental disorders, but because of this unknown risk, maybe in the future that we don't know that correlates with removing that, we have to deal with these horrible, tragic conditions now, and it just does not make any sense as a way of thinking about risk with technology, I don't think.
Yeah, so in the clip, Douthat's raising the issue of maybe that you eliminate one disorder, but in doing so, you kind of select for something else unknown. There's that concern that I think this is, I think, one of the parts in which Siddiqui does fairly well. She's been saying, like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. That's not true. But there's another kind of, I think, in pattern, the same sort of concern that I can't remember if it comes up elsewhere in the podcast, but it certainly came up in the conversation around it, which is that in eliminating some negative trait, you're also eliminating some correlated or maybe causally connected positive trait. And so as an example, my understanding is that the same genes which make somebody develop sickle cell anemia also are the genes that make people more immune to or they handle malaria better. So you could imagine like selecting embryos to ensure that your child doesn't have sickle cell, but then they lose some kind of resistance to malaria. And then the implication being, yeah, but if we all did that, then that whatever subpopulation of humans that have this trait to be immune to malaria, that would just kind of be removed. So kind of the implication of that way of thinking is pretty shockingly collectivistic. Like parents should sacrifice the possibility of having a healthy child, so some gene that the species in some sense benefits from would be preserved. And I think that's just the wrong way of thinking about why one would have a child in the first place, and of thinking about what one's moral obligations with respect to parenting are. Like your obligation as a parent is not to the preservation of the species, it's to your child. So now a kind of another version of this is I think even less convincing, but I think it's worth putting out there because I see it come up a lot with respect to this kind of technology. Here's one version of it. There's a kind of stereotype that people with autism have some kind of like cognitive advantage, or that it's correlated with some kind of like they're really good at math or something like that. And like, suppose that's true. Like, so what are you saying to parents, that we should accept having children who maybe, like, best case scenario, have like a difficult childhood, worst case scenario, require lifelong care, so that humanity can have a chance at like another mathematician or another Mozart? Like I'd love there to be another Mozart, but that I'm going to run the more likely chance of having a kid with severe disabilities because we want another Mozart. So his perspective turns parenting into a duty to the species while destroying the value to the individual parents.
Right. So let's take a look at another objection that Dowdett brings up, and this speaks to a lot of kind of the hysteria and panic that I saw online having to do with sci-fi dystopia and eugenics.
Two last questions. The
Sure.
first is about the kind of sci-fi dystopian future that a lot of people see hanging around this issue. And it relates to the fact that I think most people's expectation is that if you can figure out what polygenic scores mean for diseases, you're going to be able to figure out what polygenic scores mean for athleticism, intelligence, to say nothing of a whole host of superficial traits, right? So in which case, if you have a set of genetic technologies that cost a certain amount of money, I think you quoted me a price of $25,000, right? You are one
2,500
per embryo, right? $2,500 per embryo.
Yeah.
If this technology works as well as you say it does, then you are essentially advancing towards a future where, there will be a caste system in terms of how rich people versus poor people are genetically sculpting their offspring. Is your view that you are ushering in that kind of future?
No, I don't think so. And I think that society, fundamentally rejects that idea because it is, fundamentally so disgusting, right? I think.
So as I mentioned, in the wake of that interview, the hysteria about eugenics or about, a future caste system of like the rich genetic haves and the poor genetic have-nots was a big topic of conversation. Um, in particular, I saw a lot of people bringing up the movie Gattaca. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I just saw it for the first time. I know it's an older movie, but I just saw it for the first time not that long ago. And it depicts this kind of caste system society where um, people like their lives, the jobs they can get, the people they can form relationships with are dependent on whether how well their genetics were at birth were engineered. And so this is people's concern, and a lot of it gets tied up in the word of eugenics, or they use that as an accusation that anything that's using technology to create a healthier future child is eugenics. And I think in general this is a smear that's used to attack this kind of technology, because I mean obviously there's a huge difference between a government coercively sterilizing or murdering people who they don't want to reproduce, or having this vision of a future human society based on genetics that they think are superior. These are individual parents or prospective parents who want to have the healthiest child that they can, want their child to have a healthy, happy, flourishing life, and are taking steps to ensure that because they love their child. Like these are not in the same category. You can't compare them. And I mean, further, like everyone, whether you use this technology or not, whether you would ever want to use it, um, everybody wants to have a healthy baby. Everybody hopes for a healthy baby. You'd be a monster if you didn't. And all this technology is doing is giving you more agency and more ability to make that decision to really ensure that you're bringing a healthy child into the world.
Duthat's concern is what I was referring to earlier as an example of what used to be like a left-wing kind of perspective on technology. So it's depressing to see people like Duthat, who maybe 10 years ago would have been more um, better on this, more market-oriented in their thinking. I mean, so my response to the concern about the price creating some kind of overclass is that so long as there's not interference with the technology, and that includes like interference with how it's paid for, whether it's subsidized, whether insurance companies are like mandated to pay for it or mandated to pay for certain uses of it. Like so long as there's not interference, the price will come down as the price of new technology comes down in normal cases. And, everybody likes to say we want the price of new technology to look like TVs. Like if you look at the price of TVs, their quality versus their price over time, it's like a downward spike. But like there are some medical technologies that are like that, like elective surgeries, cosmetic surgeries, LASIK eye surgery. The price of those things go down over time and the quality goes up. So that's the area of medicine which has the least amount of interference. So long as there's no interference with the developing market around this technology, the price will come down. It won't, I assume it's never going to be like vanishingly inexpensive, but it'll come down enough that it's not just millionaires or billionaires who have it, but that typical middle class and lower middle class type people will have it. And I could imagine some scenarios in which, like, if you have the genes for a heritable trait, maybe your insurance company just wants to pay for it. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Now, second point in response to this concern is just suppose it does stay expensive. And my reaction to that is like, so what? So he referenced the movie Gattaca, and there's all kind of 20th century science fiction that has similar themes, like there'll be some new technology and only the rich people will have it, and this will, by some unspecified means, make everybody else live in misery. And like, so one is the track record of dystopian science fiction is not good. Okay, there's these kind of concerns never manifest themselves. Um, the kind of technologies people have been concerned about become normal pretty quickly, and everybody's clearly better off when. Um, so like, I'm not worse off because other people are smarter and healthier than me. And why would I be worse off if there were a lot of people who are smarter and healthier than me? I mean, I'm better off because of that. Because the choice isn't between a smarter me and a smarter them. It's between me as I am without smart neighbors and me as I am with smart neighbors. That's the future. Like, a future with more Albert Einsteins is not bad because I'm not one of the Albert Einsteins. It's good. Now, on the issue of eugenics, so I agree that it's a smear term, and it's a smear that packages together, it's a life enhancing technology with this the early 20th century push to in some way make the species better, and usually forcibly better. So like in the United States, it was forced sterilization of so-called undesirable people or people with genetic disorders or heritable diseases. In Germany, it was murder. And like, nobody is advocating that at all, that anybody be forced to use this technology. There's nothing inherent in any technology that you be forced to use it. So there's a real kind of sleight of hand going here where they're deliberately, I think people who have philosophical or religious fears concerning modifying human beings, like artificially modifying human beings, have, uh, they're attempting to make any technology that might do that sound like it's, um, it, you know, killing disabled people. So I think it's a pretty clear smear. And I expect over the next few years, as more and more preventative medicine becomes available, as well as enhancement biotech, like that's one of the things Duthat raised, was this could be used for enhancement. I think we're going to see more and more of this kind of smear and complaint. I mean, to just take something pretty mild, like the drug Ozempic. This is unnatural. This is cheating. You're somehow like, there's something, I don't know, deficient about your character if you use this instead of like going on a diet and going to the gym. And like, why? Is it wrong to use technology to make your life better? Why is it wrong to use technology to make your offspring better? And like, part of the reason you can see that I think this eugenics issue really is a smear is, just think about for a second, how do people pair up? Usually smart people pair with other smart people. Attractive people pair with other attractive people. Less intelligent and dumb people kind of wind up together too. So people already make decisions that have, eugenic implications. There's another movie which is it's hard to classify as a dystopia because it's a farce, called Idiocracy, where all of the smart people stop reproducing and all the dumb people reproduce. So in the future, everybody's stupid. And like, that's that's, like I said, it's a farce, but it's picking up on something that we're already in a certain way doing, is that we're selectively pairing. And part of the reason you choose a partner is, especially if it's somebody to have children with, you think in some way like they'd make a good father or a good mother, or like you kind of think about what the combination of the two of you would look like in another person. And like, why is it okay if you do it by dating a bunch of people and picking one, but it's not okay if you date a bunch of people, pick one, and then like use some kind of technology to further refine the outcome. So like if you really have a problem with this kind of like making reproductive choices to have offspring with positive traits, then you have to have a problem with dating for choosing a partner, because that's in an important way, that's like selecting what kind of offspring you'll have. So I mean, there's, like I was saying, there's a growing skepticism of using technology to change ourselves, gene editing, prenatal screening, different. There's drugs coming on the market that are intended, at first to cure diseases, but have obvious enhancing quality. So I mentioned Ozempic. There's related drugs that increase muscle mass that's for people with like serious diseases where they're losing muscle or they're on Ozempic. And part of the problem with Ozempic is you lose both fat and muscle. So you kind of combine these drugs and then you don't have that problem. But like, obviously athletes are going to use it. People who want to look fit when they're 60 are going to use it, that's a very simple thing. But I think the trajectory of the technology is clear, and I think we're going to see more and more of this kind of pushback. So this is one of the things, like, this is interesting. This podcast and the reaction is interesting because I think the more of this kind of changing our natural form is going to be more and more technologically possible, and it'll be it's exciting because I think this is, all things being equal, a very good development, but it'll be interesting to see how a lot of religious and philosophical mistakes come to head when people can take a pill and stop aging. Let's say that's possible at some point. Yeah, you're kind of escaping God's judgment, aren't you? You're not going to die, or at least you're not guaranteed to die. So you get this kind of genetics smear coming across, and the important thing to keep in mind is this is the reason to do these things is to make yourself and your offspring better off. The point of the technology is not to change the human race, even though that might be some kind of byproduct, and it's not to do it forcibly. And that's really important, that it's a voluntary decision and a forced decision they have to be kept in different categories.
Yeah, so you mentioned kind of like the potential for like enhancement and just general improvements that people might pursue. So very like related to this kind of eugenic concern is there were not in the podcast necessarily, I don't think Dow that brought this out explicitly, but definitely in the conversation, people were talking about how if parents are trying to prevent having certain their children having certain developmental disorders or disabilities, that this is communicating something to the people who currently either live with them or struggle with these disorders or disabilities. For example, saying like, if you choose not to implant an embryo that would have Down syndrome, that you're now saying to all the people with Down syndrome living that their life isn't worth living, or they would be better off if they didn't exist or something like that. And they object to the technology on those grounds. And first, like in my view, I just don't think those two things follow at all. Not wanting to take steps to prevent your future child from having to struggle in life and to like deal with really, really difficult circumstances is not saying anything about the value of the life of a person who does have that condition. I mean, you can take lots of other examples. Like before we had a cure for polio, the people who are looking for a cure and who are working on it, they're not saying all the people who suffered from polio and ended up paralyzed or crippled as a result, their life has no value. That's not at all what is happening. What's happening is they have a dedication to what human life is, and they want to make it better, and they're committed to helping the best that's possible happen. It's from a love of humanity that you would make that kind of choice, in my view.
Yeah, this is a typically I think of as more of like a left tribe kind of concern, but I think it's interesting in that it's brings with it a mystical perspective, in that when we're talking about, let's say, so take Down syndrome, we're talking about a future in which there are no people born with Down syndrome. That's the implication of this technology. And why is that concerning? Those people don't exist. And there's a kind of like, I think, magical way of thinking about this where it's like there's some particular person who would exist and you're doing something to prevent them from, and that's like murder, or that's like this is occasionally raised in the context of the deaf, like cultural genocide. Is the deaf people have, in a sense, their own culture, because if you're born deaf, you don't speak English in the way that, so you have your own language and everything. And it's like, yeah, that would go away. And isn't this some kind of crime or, immorality? And it's, well, if you think there's like some people who don't exist yet, but exist in some other respect, and you're like, preventing them from, but that's not the way any of this works. There are no individuals who have anything until they actually are born and exist and develop. And I think a good way to think to see that there's some kind of mystical thinking here is there are already some heritable disorders which have been eliminated or very nearly so. And for example, the Tay-Sachs disorder, which affected some Jewish populations, has almost been eliminated since screening for it was developed 50 years ago. And like that's a pretty brutal one if you go on your own time and read into what it is. So it's not like there's a whole culture of people with that disease that you could, but it's essentially the same thing. There's few, and eventually probably no one will be born with that. And then eventually it's not just no one will be born with that, but just that the genes for passing that on will probably be eliminated too. And is that some big tragedy? Like, no, that's great that people don't have to, prospective parents don't have to worry about that possibility anymore. And that's I think the right way to think about it. It's not that anyone's being harmed or diminished. It's that certain conditions that you wouldn't wish on anyone, even if you value someone who has them, will be gone. And that's the right way to look at it. It's not a war on the blind or the developmentally disabled or the deaf, or it's a war on the condition, not the people. No different than if you offered someone with a disability a cure would be to say, well, if you don't take the cure, your life doesn't matter. Like, that's not the right perspective.
So I want to end with the final question that Dowd poses to Siddiqui about whether or not we're losing something human with this technology. So let's play that clip.
A last question. You are excited about a world in which lots and lots more babies than is the case right now are born from laboratory fertilization. And I'm just curious if you think, allowing that this might be desirable in certain cases, if a world where this became the norm would be losing something that is very fundamental to human beings and human families and human relationships. And that's the relationship between sex and procreation, between you and your husband having sex, apologies, and the future generations that come into being. And I'm going to take the podcaster's privilege. I apologize for this, but I'm going to read you a piece of a poem. It's by a poet named Galway Kinnell, and the poem is called "After Making Love, We Hear Footsteps." And the idea is sort of contained in the title, that the husband and wife make love, and it wakes up their child, and the child comes and gets in bed with them. And Kinnell writes, "In the half-darkness, we look at each other and smile and touch arms across this little startlingly muscled body, this one whom habit of memory propels to the ground of his making. Sleeper only the mortal sounds can sing awake. This blessing love gives again into our arms." Sorry. Do you worry about removing or diminishing from human experience that aspect of being a husband and a wife in a relationship with a child?
What do you mean?
I mean, in your future, the feeling in a future where orchid technology becomes a norm, the feeling that poet is expressing, where a man and a woman make love, and by making love, they bring a new life into the world that they haven't sculpted or engineered in any way, that is given to them out of the self-giving from each other, that forms this profound connection between sex, the way you love your partner, and the family that you brought into being. And again, this, allowing that we're in a world where people have genetic disorders, and there are all kinds of reasons that people would consider other ways of having children, you're imagining a future where that just sort of goes away. And I'm wondering if you think anything would actually be lost if that goes away. If 90% of babies are born through IVF, and having sex and having a baby out of that becomes this weird thing that the Amish do, aren't you pushing some really intimate and important aspect of human experience out of human experience?
So this was probably, at least on my corner of Twitter, the most posted and discussed clip from the entire podcast. And it was really presented as this profound gotcha. Look at the bleak spiritual impoverishment of the people who promote this kind of technology. They can't, she can't even understand what question he's asking and what feeling the poet is trying to get at. And that just shows how how dystopian this whole project is. Or at least that's the message that people took from this clip. And to me, if the question is, do we lose something, because the way he puts it is, do we lose something fundamental to being a human being, severing sex from procreation? And it's in the context of the child is given to you. You don't have a choice over what child you're given. It's just given to you, and you have to make do. My answer is no. Because I don't view human beings as fundamentally victims of nature, the vagaries of nature, or as humans are not just, they have to submit to forces outside of their control. In my view, human beings, what makes us human is that we're victors over nature, that we master and command and transform it to make our lives better. And that with technology like this, we gain something. We live up to our nature and our capability of harnessing our potential to have happier, healthier, more flourishing lives.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one of the things that Duthat says in that excerpt, I just noticed this time we were listening to it. He says the couple hasn't sculpted or engineered the child in any way. And I already said this, but that's just not true. You do that when you choose a partner. And you even to some extent do that when you choose when to have a child. It's everyone who's thought about being a parent is familiar with the fact that, yeah, there's more risks when you're older. So maybe you plan to have a child when you're younger, or maybe not. Maybe you accept the risks, and everybody, not everybody, but plenty of people do that kind of calculation, and that's a kind of sculpting, engineering. In a sense, it's massaging the odds, if you want to think about it that way, because you can't like directly, we're gonna have a child when we're 26, and that automatically means this or that. Like that's not so. But there is sculpting or engineering going on already, just in thinking about who to procreate with, and um, planning when to have the child, and so on. So it's just the I don't know about the poem, but the lesson that's taken from the poem is just that's just not true. That when people have some people do that, they just sleep with whoever and know if there's a baby. But people who are a little deliberate about it are already doing this, and why not do it even more with more self-consciousness and control? The other thing is, yeah, it's often the case that um, uh, people have children from um, normal, fun, loving sex, but and this is Sam, we talked about this before the podcast. There's like plenty of depictions of this kind of thing that happens for a lot of people in kind of movies, comedy setting, that they're having trouble conceiving, so they have taking their body's temperature, what time of the month and the cycle, and like the men doing things to increase their sperm count, and like, and then they, when they're deep enough into that kind of um, process, especially if they're having a lot of trouble, one of the things that can happen is that sex act becomes mechanical. Like, oh, we're at the right temperature, and well, I'm not really feeling it, but we got to do it because we want to have this kid, and that kind of medicalizes in a certain respect the whole process. So does that like diminish something about reproduction? I don't think so. Like, why would it do that? Like, yeah, sometimes it you just say, okay, we're gonna go off contraception and just wait for it to happen. And if you're I guess lucky and are biologically lucky, then just take real quick. And if not, you have to be really deliberate about it, and you go to fertility doctors and everything. And that doesn't, why does, he's not saying that diminishes anything. And like, think that through, like just trying to have a kid as opposed to just letting it happen, like diminish the intimacy of the relationship or the love for the, no, people will still have sex for, like Siddiqui points this out, like for plenty of poetry worthy reasons. And you could always wonder where the technology goes, that maybe there's some way to, in some future scenario, like engineer the sex act to be part of this whole thing, if that's fun for somebody, or if somebody just wants to get it over with. I mean, there's other related things that don't come up in the podcast, but is worried that people have all kind of concern. Surrogacy is another kind of thing that people would, well, doesn't that sever the intimacy between mother and child? And you could imagine in the not too distant future, artificial wombs, and those kind of things. That, to me, just, if anything, um, it makes it so more people can experience being a parent, because there's all kind of valid reasons. You want a child, but you don't want to go through, there's certain risks, maybe to you individually or just generically, or you have several things you want to do in life and you're torn between them. And like, if I'm pregnant for 9 months, like I can't do a certain, career or something, or whatever it might be. But if I could have an artificial womb and I don't have to carry the child myself, and then I just have a baby, like that makes a whole new way of life better. I don't think there's any worldly validity to these concerns. I think probably what's going on here is a lot of people have some kind of attachment to the natural way of doing things. And for some people, it's overtly religious. For other people, they might say it's for secular reasons, but it's coming from a religious way of thinking about life. And this is just all of this is just part of that. Nature's just good, and how dare you modify nature?
No, definitely. And it's something I don't sympathize with at all. Like, I'm so jealous of the future people who have artificial wombs. Like, if we had that, absolutely 100%, I'm going down that path. That'd be amazing. I'm very jealous. But thank you, Mike, for joining me and talking about this today. I really enjoyed it.
Interesting conversation. Thanks for raising the issue, Sam.
Yeah. So some resources I wanted to point the audience to learn more about our topic or to see it from different angles. One essay by Ayn Rand is The Anti-Industrial Revolution. In this piece, she's talking about the anti-tech opposition posed by the environmentalists of her time. And I think there's a lot of parallels, especially with this point that you were just making, Mike, about um, kind of elevating the natural way of doing things above real living, breathing human beings and, their lives that they're trying to achieve. Another piece written by our colleague, Ben Bayer, he wrote a year or so ago called The Absurdity at the Heart of the Alabama IVF Controversy. I really enjoy his analogy that he puts about embryos in here, kind of picking apart why they don't have rights in that piece. Another is Of Living Death by Ayn Rand, and Ben Bayer's book, Why the Right to Abortion is Sacrosanct. But thank you all for listening today. Don't forget to subscribe and comment, and you can send any questions or comments to newideal@aynrand.org.